Last time, we have discussed about the theory of special relativity and its consequences. So we know that one of the consequences of the theory of special relativity is about time dilation. And what is time dilation? It means that the time or the clock or the moving clock will be perceived to run slow when observed from a stationary frame of reference. And that is described using this equation. T is equal to TO over square root of 1 minus V squared over C squared. So this is the time, the observed time in the moving clock. This is the rest time. And this is what we call the time dilation formula. It means that the time on the moving frame will be perceived to run slow as observed by a stationary frame. That is what we call time dilation. And we also know that the length of an object when it is moving will be perceived to be shortened or to be shorter when observed from a stationary frame of reference. And that is what we call the length contraction. And it is described or defined using this equation. The L, or the observed length, is the length of the moving frame, is equal to the LO, or the square root of 1 minus V squared over C squared multiplied by the length of the rest frame, or the LO. That is what we call the length contraction. It means that when an object is moving, the length will be perceived to be shorter. That is the meaning of the length contraction. And we also know that the mass of an object when it is moving will also increase, and that is what we call the relativistic mass, where in theory there is no such thing as relativistic mass. So we will just write it here to emphasize, because that will be used when we derive mass and energy. So it is mass is equal to the rest mass over square root of 1 minus V squared over C squared. So this is the relativistic mass. And I just want to clarify that there is no such thing as relativistic mass. Okay, so sinulat ko lang yan dito because this equation is very important when we derive the mass and energy equivalence. Okay, so these are the equation. This is the equation for time dilation, or the time in the moving frame will be perceived to run slow as observed in the stationary frame. So kapag may magdaan dyan sa akin, I will observe the time in that moving frame to run slower, mas mabagal ang time sa kapag mag-travel. Now dito, this is length contraction. Ang ibig sabihin lang yan, if mayroon akong makita na object na nag-travel, I will perceive the length of this object to be shorter. So mag-shorter yan according to my frame of reference. That is length contraction. Moving object will be shorter. This is mass increase. Mass increase, or this is the relativistic mass. Again, there is no such thing as relativistic mass. Sinulat ko yan because that will be used later. That means na if I am going to observe an object moving at very high speed, then I will perceive that the mass of that object will be increased. Mas mabigat na yang object na yan if that is moving. So those are the consequences of the special theory of relativity. Now, one of the most famous consequences, or one of the most famous equation as a consequence of the theory of special relativity is the equation E is equal to mc squared. I know, medyo familiar yan na equation na yan. Lahat siguro ng tao familiar sa equation na yan. Now, that is the mass energy equivalence. Ang tawag natin dito is mass energy equivalence. Yan. Pero saan ba galing yung equation na yan? Okay, so saan ba galing yan? So we are going to derive that equation and we are going to interpret ano ba ang ibig sabihin ng equation na yan. We will be using calculus to derive that equation. So we will start with a definition of kinetic energy. So ano ba yung definition ng kinetic energy natin? So we will assign terms. Assign natin ng terms. Let us assume or let us agree that K will stand for kinetic energy. Okay? So the change of kinetic energy or dk, we all know that that is the same as the change of the work, because kinetic energy is the energy associated with motion. And that is the same as the work or the change of work performed in moving that object. Ano ba yung definition of work natin in Newtonian physics? Ang alam natin that work is equal to the force times the change of position, or the dx, the delta x, force times the change of position. That is just the definition of work in classical or Newtonian physics. Now, ano ba yung definition ng force natin sa second law of motion? We know that force is equal to mass times acceleration. Tama? Mass times acceleration naman yung force. However, we are going to use the definition of force in terms of momentum. Ano ba yung definition ng force natin in terms of momentum? We know that force is equal to the change of momentum divided by the change of what? The change of time. Okay? Yan yung definition ng force. Change of momentum divided by the change of time. Sir, bakit ganyan, sir? Di ba mass times acceleration naman yan? Remember the definition of momentum? Ano ba yung definition ng momentum? The definition of momentum is mass times velocity. Okay? Divided by the change of time, or dt. And we know that velocity divided by time is the acceleration. Okay? So that is why it is just the same as mass times acceleration. So tanggalin ko na yan. We are going to use dt, or the change of momentum, in deriving the mass energy equivalence. So force is equal to the change of momentum divided by the change of time, dp over dx. So we are going to substitute this term in this equation, and that equation will become, so dito ko na lang ilagay ha. So dk is equal to force is dp over dt times dx. Ito, dx. Yan, dx. So that will be our equation. Now, ano bang ibig sabihin ng dx? Anong ibig sabihin ng dx over dt? Ito na equation na yan. Ano bang ibig sabihin nito? Dx over dt. That is just the velocity. Remember, the change of position divided by the change of time is equal to the velocity of our object. So, ibig sabihin, this equation will just become dp, and this is the velocity. So, sulat natin dito, velocity. Now, from the classical definition of physics, we know that momentum is equal to mv. That is classical physics, that is Newtonian physics. Alam natin yan. Tapos na yan sa discuss natin sa mechanics. Now, we are going to substitute this term or this equation in this equation dito. Sa equation na to, dito. That will become dp. dp is equal to mv. So substitute natin mv times v. Now, this is the product rule for derivatives. So we will use product rule. This will become m dv plus v dm, and then multiplied by v, same v. Okay, now we are going to distribute v to these terms. So ang mangyayari, this will become mv, distribute lang natin si v, dv, okay, plus, distribute natin ulit si v, that will become v squared, yan, v squared dm. Okay, so meron na tayong first equation. Tatawagin natin itong first equation. Sulat ko ha, so dk, yan, dk is equal to mv dv plus v squared dm. This is our equation 1. Now, we will use the relativistic mass para ma-relate natin si mass and energy. This is energy, of course, mass, kasi mass and energy ang kailangan natin. Now, we are going to use mass. Now, in relativity, we know that the mass is equal to the rest mass over square root of 1 minus v squared over c squared. This is the formula for relativistic mass, where m is the relativistic mass. Again, there is no such thing as relativistic mass. Sinulat ko lang yan because that is important to derive the mass and energy equivalence. This is the rest mass, or the mass of an object at rest when it is not moving. Okay, we can rewrite this equation. I-rewrite natin yung equation para mas madali siya i-differentiate. This will become mass, copy lang, is equal to MO for the rest mass multiplied by this one. It will become 1 minus V squared over C squared to the power of negative 1/2. Negative 1/2. So that is actually rewrite lang na ako ang equation into a simpler term. Now, let us differentiate this equation. We are going to take the derivative of this equation with respect to velocity because this is a function of velocity. So, i-differentiate natin yan with respect to velocity. Again, because again, this is a function of velocity. So, copy natin yan ng equation, M. This is MO. Copy lang. 1 minus v squared over c squared to the power of negative 1/2. Okay, we are going to take the derivative of this equation to the both side of the equations. Derivative of what? Derivative with respect to velocity, because again, this is a function of velocity. So we will apply that to the both sides of the equation. So this will become dm over dv equals. Now remember, the rest mass is invariant. This is a constant. When we talk about invariant, when a quantity is said to be invariant, that means it remains the same in all inertial frames of reference, just like the speed of light. It is invariant. Ibig sabihin, the speed of light is just the same in all inertial frames of reference. Kahit saan na frame of reference ka, the same lang ang speed of light. The same with our rest mass. Our rest mass is constant. It's invariant. So this is constant. So we will retain that, MO. Now this is chain rule. Apply natin dito ang chain rule. Okay, start tayo sa exponent rule. Remember pa siguro yung exponent rule, no? So we will transfer the exponent here. So negative 1/2. And then copy this term, 1 minus v squared over c squared. Remember pa, na kapag sa exponent rule tayo, subtract natin dito ng minus 1. Di ba? Mag-minus 1 man tadre. So negative 1/2 minus 1 is negative 3/2. Now, chain rule ito. So we are going to derive or differentiate this term na nasa loob. Chain rule. So differentiate natin si 1 minus v squared over c squared. Okay, this is a difference. So ano ba yung rule natin sa difference? So differentiate natin si 1. What is the derivative of 1? This is constant. So ibig sabihin this will become 0. So hindi ko na lang isulat. 0 maghihapon na. Now we are going to differentiate this term. This is derivative of v. Ano ba yung derivative ng v squared? So that is 2v. Retains a negative. Sulat ko na lang dito ang 0 ha. 0. This is v squared. So magiging 2v. C squared is constant. So retain c squared. So continue. We are going to simplify the terms. So si 0, tanggalon na ako si 0. Okay, wala na magyapon na siya. Dili siya significant. Si 0, tanggal. Now ano yung makancel natin dito? Si 2. Makancel si 2 because no ay 2 dire na po 2 dire sa pika. So cancel. Negative times negative, positive. So cancel lang gihapon nato na. Ano na lang yung naiwan sa ating equation? Then ang naiwan na lang is MO times ito. This is 1 minus v squared over c squared to the power of negative 3/2 Yan, ito na naiwan. And then, dito sa kabila, ang naiwan na lang is V over C squared. Over C squared. If you notice, parang familiar ito na equation. Ito na equation. This is just almost the same as this equation. I-underline to ha. Anong kulay? Blue? Sige, blue. This equation, ito, parang pareho siya sa equation na to. Yan. Ang kaibahan lang nila is this is negative 3 halves and this is negative 1 half. So we can expand, rather. I-expand natin yung equation na yan para mas magagamit natin later. This is M0 or the rest mas times. Retain natin yung para pareho siya dito. 1 minus V squared over C squared to the power of negative 1 half times. Para ma-retain ang negative 3 halves, of course, C squared to the power of negative 1 para ma-retain ang negative 3 halves. Para negative 1 half minus 1 is equal to negative 3 halves. Gi-expand lang na ako na siya nga equation. Okay? Now, dito, multiply natin. This will become V, retain pala. Wala man tigihimo na. Retain. V squared over C squared. Now, remember this term. This term is very important. Ito na term. Yan. Ano bang ibig sabihin ng term na to? The M sub O times ito na term. That is just this equation. Ito, yan. Pareho lang sila, tama? So we can just substitute M into this equation. This will become M. So this is just M. Lahat yan. Ito, M. So copy. Now ito, you just simplify. So C squared minus V squared all over C squared to the power of negative 1. Multiplied by, that is V over C squared. Now, we will continue natin. Malapit na tayo matapos naglabad na itong ulo ni. Okay, yan. So sulat natin dito, ano na yan ang equation? dm over dv. So dm over dv is equal to m times c squared minus v squared over c squared to the power of negative 1 times v over c squared. Now, this is negative 1. So, ibig sabihin, pwede natin siya i-reciprocate. So, this will become m times, reciprocate yan, si c squared na sa taas, si c squared minus v squared na yung nasa baba, kasi negative 1 yan, times v over c squared. Ano yung mag-cancel dito? Mag-cancel si c squared kasi may c squared sa numerator and then may c squared din sa denominator. So let us cancel c squared. Okay? So ano na lang yung naiwan sa equation natin? Ang naiwan na lang sa equation natin is dm over dv is equal to, anong naiwan sa numerator? Ang naiwan sa numerator is mv. So yan, mv over dito sa denominator, that is c squared minus v squared. So yan yung naiwan sa ating equation kasi nag-cancel na si c squared. Now we are going to cross multiply. So cross multiply, so magiging dm multiplied by c squared minus v squared. Yan, multiply lang, cross multiply is equal to cross multiply, this will become mv times dv. Cross multiply lang na. Okay? Now we are going to distribute dm. Distribute natin si dm. So dm, So distribute natin sa dm. This will become c squared. C squared dm minus v squared dm. Ito. V squared dm. Tama? Distribute man. V squared dm equals mv dv. Now, we are going to transpose natin si negative v squared dm sa kabilang equation. That will become c squared dm is equal to mv dv, positive na, plus v squared dm. So that will now be our equation 2. So meron na tayong equation 2. So we have c squared dm is equal to mv dv plus v squared dm. This is our equation 2. Okay, erase ko muna dito banda ha. Let us compare let us compare equation 1 and equation 3. Compare natin dito natin isulat. Compare sa dito ko isulat sa taas. Yan. Compare lang natin yan. If you notice, pareho lang sila ng equation. MVdV plus V squared dm, MVdV plus V squared dm. So, ibig sabihin, dk, so dito ha, dk is equal to c squared dm. Now, this is derivative. So, to attain our final equation, we will use antiderivative or the integral. So, kunin natin yung integral nito na side equation from 0 to kinetic energy. Okay, dito din sa kabila, we'll get the antiderivative from, this is a function of mass. So from the rest mass, m0 to the relativistic mass. Again, there is no such thing as relativistic mass. So our final equation will become K is equal to, this is constant. Remember, this is the speed of light. That is constant. So labas natin yan. So this is c squared times the antiderivative from rest mass to the relativistic mass of dm. So that means kinetic energy is equal to c squared times m or the relativistic mass minus the rest mass. Ayan. Okay, so let us distribute c squared to both sides of the equation. Distribute natin ha. This is mc squared. This will become minus m0 c squared. Ayan. So that is now our final equation. So that means, sulat natin dito ha. This is the kinetic energy. This is the kinetic energy. Ayan. This is the what? This is the rest energy or energy when an object is at rest. This is the total energy. The total energy. Ayan. So when we are going to solve for the total energy, that is just total energy is equal to mc squared. Ayan. Remember that m here is relativistic mass. Okay, so that means that is just the Lorentz factor. Yan, para isulat yung Lorentz factor times the rest mass c squared. Now in terms of kinetic energy and rest energy, pwede natin makuha yung total energy. Total energy is equal to kinetic energy, yan, or KE na lang ha, kinetic energy para mas maintindihan. Kinetic energy plus the potential energy or the rest energy plus rest energy. So yan ang equation. That's how the mass energy equivalence is being derived. Okay, so E is equal to mc squared, or that E is equal to mc squared. This is the total energy of an object. Or when we will define the rest mass energy, this is m0. That's the rest mass energy. Oh, yun. That's how the mass energy equivalence is being derived. So basically, hindi nyo na lahat i-memorize yung equations na yan because that is the derivation. Pinakita ko lang kung paano na-derive yung mass energy equivalence using the laws and principles of physics and applying the concepts of calculus. Okay, so nakuha na natin yung mass and energy equivalence. Ano ba ang ibig sabihin ng mass and energy equivalence?